A routine errand. The sun had barely risen, casting a gentle glow over the small town of Maplewood as Mrs. Louise Carter prepared for her weekly trip to the grocery store. At 78 years old, her life had been marked by both struggles and triumphs, and she had learned to navigate the ups and downs with grace. Today, however, felt different. A palpable sense of anxiety settled over her as she stood in her modest living room, surveying the items laid out on the table for her shopping list. Among them was a stark reminder of her new reality: adult diapers. Mrs. Louise moved slowly, her joints protesting with each deliberate action as she adjusted her faded floral dress, a relic from a time when life had felt much simpler. She glanced at the crumpled paper in her hand, where her shopping list was scrawled in shaky handwriting, and her heart sank a little more as she saw the last item. The thought of purchasing diapers was something she never anticipated in her golden years, especially for her husband, Mr. Carter. As she walked toward their bedroom, the weight of her responsibilities pressed heavily upon her. Her husband lay motionless on their bed, a stark reminder of the toll life had taken on them. Once a proud soldier with dreams of a vibrant future, Mr. Carter had been left partially paralyzed after an injury during his service. The spinal cord damage had transformed their lives, turning them into caregivers, grappling with the realities of medical appointments, therapies, and the emotional toll of dependency. Now it was Mrs. Louise who was responsible for ensuring that he was cared for, providing him with the love and support that he had always given her. "Carter," she whispered softly, leaning down to kiss his forehead. His eyes, still sharp and alert despite his immobile body, met hers with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. They shared a profound bond forged over decades, yet the burden of his condition hung heavy in the air. "I'm heading to the store now," she assured him, trying to muster the strength she often found in their shared history. As she gathered her reusable shopping bags, worn from years of use, and the list, she hesitated at the door. A wave of uncertainty washed over her as she recalled the whispers, the judgmental glances she had encountered in the past. Her heart raced at the thought of facing the world, of navigating the aisles with a pack of adult diapers clutched tightly to her chest. With a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and stepped outside, leaving the comfort of their home behind. The cool morning air hit her face, and she felt a sense of resolve settle in. This was her responsibility. She had to push through for Carter. As she entered Simmons's grocery store, a familiar chime echoed softly above her, a sound that had greeted her for years. The store was a small, family-run establishment, a fixture in Maplewood with narrow aisles and an array of goods that often felt overwhelming. Mrs. Louise had walked through those doors countless times, but today felt different. She nodded at the cashier, a young man who barely acknowledged her presence as he tapped on his phone. Mrs. Louise was accustomed to this invisibility, a common experience for many elderly people who often felt overlooked in society. She moved carefully, her heart racing as she made her way to the hygiene aisle. Every step felt like a reminder of her circumstances, a gauntlet of imagined stares and whispers. As she reached for the package of adult diapers, she felt a familiar flush of embarrassment creep up her cheeks. The plastic crinkled loudly, and she winced, glancing around as if expecting to see curious onlookers. It was a simple errand, but it felt monumental. The weight of the package felt insurmountable in her hands, a physical representation of the struggles she had faced. Clutching the package to her chest, she approached the checkout, and her heart sank when she saw a line of customers ahead of her. Anxiety twisted in her stomach as she took her place at the end of the line. The sound of laughter floated toward her, and she felt her cheeks grow warm with humiliation. Her gaze remained fixed on the ground, her mind racing with thoughts of the judgment that awaited her. Just a few more minutes, she told herself. Soon, this part would be over, and she could return home to Carter, where the world outside couldn't reach them. But as she inched closer to the front of the line, a booming voice shattered her hopes of an unremarkable exit. A police officer, his crisp uniform a stark contrast to her faded attire, stood behind her chatting with another customer. His jovial tone seemed to echo throughout the store, and Mrs. Louise's heart began to race. She tried to focus on the scuffed linoleum floor beneath her feet, but the officer's voice cut through her thoughts. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" he said, his laughter ringing out like an unwelcome intrusion. Mrs. Louise tensed, feeling the weight of his gaze upon her back. She wished she could shrink away, become invisible, but the officer's presence loomed large. As she moved closer to the checkout counter, her grip on the package tightened, and she could feel the crinkling plastic reminding her of the embarrassment that awaited her. Then the officer's voice changed, dripping with mockery. "Look at that," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "Buying diapers at her age. Must be for her poor thing. Can't even take care of herself." In that moment, time seemed to stand still for Mrs. Louise. The laughter that erupted from the surrounding customers felt like daggers piercing through her heart. The embarrassment she had been holding at bay crashed over her, leaving her trembling and exposed. She stood frozen, unable to respond as the shame wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. Each second stretched into an eternity as Mrs. Louise placed the diapers on the conveyor belt, her face burning with humiliation. She couldn't meet the eyes of the other customers, couldn't bear to see their pity or disdain. The young cashier, Isaac, scanned her items with an air of indifference, but Mrs. Louise could sense a flicker of concern in his eyes as they briefly met. The officer continued his cruel remarks, feeding off the attention he was receiving. "That's what happens when you get old," he declared, his tone mocking. "You start acting like a baby again." Mrs. Louise's heart sank further as laughter echoed around her, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. The dignity she had fought to maintain began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. Her hand shook as she gripped the handle of her cart, desperately wishing for the strength to speak up, to defend herself, to share the love and devotion she had for her husband. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood there, silent and trembling, wishing to disappear. She thought of Carter and the love they shared, the sacrifices they had made together, and it fueled her resolve. She could not let this moment define her. She had to endure it for him. Mrs. Louise took a deep breath, focusing on the scuffed floor, counting the tiles to ground herself, willing herself to become invisible. The young cashier continued to scan her items, and the tension in the store escalated. Mrs. Louise's mind raced back to the love that had sustained her through the challenges of their life together. She was determined not to let this humiliation rob her of her dignity. Yet, as the officer's laughter echoed around her, she felt the walls closing in. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, but Mrs. Louise reminded herself of her purpose. She had to remain strong for Carter. As she stood in that grocery store, the weight of the world on her shoulders, she was determined to rise above the mockery and live out the love that defined her life. Part 2. Finding strength. After what felt like an eternity, the cashier completed the transaction, handing Mrs. Louise her change with a neutral expression. She could feel the officer's eyes still lingering on her, as if waiting for another opportunity to ridicule her. With a deep breath, she grabbed her bags, clutching them tightly, as if they were a shield against the world. Stepping outside, she felt the warm sunlight envelop her, offering a brief respite from the humiliation she had just endured. The grocery store loomed behind her, but the real challenge lay ahead, returning to Carter and sharing her day with him. She fought against the tears threatening to spill, telling herself that she would not let this moment define her. As she drove home, the streets of Maplewood blurred past her. The town had always felt like a safe haven, a place where everyone knew each other. But today, the familiar landscape seemed foreign, tainted by the officer's cruel words. Thoughts of Carter filled her mind, and she longed for the comfort of his presence. He was her anchor, the one who had always believed in her strength even when she doubted herself. When she arrived home, the sight of their small house brought her a sense of relief. She walked inside, greeted by the faint smell of his favorite aftershave lingering in the air. As she moved through the living room, she spotted Carter, lying in bed, his expression still as warm and loving as she remembered. "Hey, love," she said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "How are you feeling today?" He offered a slight smile, his eyes conveying a world of emotions that words could never express. Despite his physical limitations, there was a spark of resilience in his gaze that inspired her. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, a gesture of affection that always seemed to lift his spirits. "I went to the store," she began, hesitating as the unforeseen support. As Mrs. Louise stood at the checkout counter, the weight of her embarrassment hung heavy in the air, threatening to suffocate her. The murmurs and laughter from the onlookers felt like daggers piercing her heart. She could feel the officer's eyes boring into her back, a constant reminder of her vulnerability. In that moment, she felt utterly alone in a crowd, as if the walls of the store had closed in around her, isolating her from the world outside. The young cashier, Isaac, continued scanning her items, his movements steady yet unhurried. Despite the surrounding chaos, he focused intently on his task, his face a mask of neutrality. But in the brief moments when their eyes met, Mrs. Louise detected a glimmer of empathy in his gaze, a silent acknowledgement of her pain. It was a small comfort amid the swirling negativity, a reminder that perhaps not everyone saw her as the object of ridicule. As the last of her items were scanned, the laughter around her continued to echo, but Mrs. Louise found her resolve beginning to shift. The inner strength she had drawn from her husband's steadfastness started to seep into her. It was a strength that had sustained them both through the darkest days of his illness, a strength born from love, sacrifice, and resilience. She couldn't let the officer's cruelty diminish that. "Ma'am, your total is $58.75, Isaac announced, his voice breaking through the din. It felt surreal to hear the number, as if the world had come to a standstill. She fumbled in her purse, the fabric softening under her trembling hands. "Just a moment, please," she murmured, struggling to keep her voice steady. In those few seconds, she took a deep breath, allowing her mind to wander back to the countless memories that had shaped her life. A life filled with both joy and sorrow, love and heartache. She thought of how Mr. Carter had always been her rock, how they had built a life together in the face of adversity. "What's wrong, lady? Can't even afford your diapers?" The officer's voice cut through her reverie, cruel and mocking. The laughter that followed felt like a physical assault, the weight of their disdain bearing down on her fragile spirit. In that moment, something snapped inside Mrs. Louise. Years of quietly bearing the weight of judgment transformed into a surge of defiance. How dare he mock her for caring for her husband? How dare he belittle her sacrifices? She took another deep breath, grounding herself in the reality of her situation. "I'm not buying these for me," she said, her voice steadying. It was a quiet declaration, yet it reverberated through the stillness. The laughter faltered, surprised by her unexpected response. The officer looked at her with a mixture of confusion and irritation, as if her words had thrown him off balance. "Excuse me," he sneered, the arrogance in his voice still evident, but Mrs. Louise felt a surge of empowerment. "These are for my husband," she continued, her tone unwavering. "He fought for this country, for the very freedom you flaunt in that uniform. He served with honor, and now he relies on me to take care of him." The other customers fell silent, a palpable shift in the atmosphere as her words hung in the air. Mrs. Louise felt the heat of the spotlight, but instead of retreating, she stepped into it. "He is a proud man, reduced to this by an injury he sustained while serving. Every day, I care for him, and I do it with love. These diapers are a symbol of our shared struggle, not a punchline for your jokes." The officer's expression shifted, the bravado fading from his face. He opened his mouth, perhaps to retort, but Mrs. Louise pressed on. "You think it's easy. You think I enjoy being here, buying these. I come here because my husband deserves dignity in his later years, despite the challenges we face. What have you done to help others today?" The words flowed from her like a river breaking free from a dam, each one infused with the strength of 1,000 memories, each one a testament to her and Mr. Carter's journey together. Around her, the other customers began to nod, their expressions shifting from curiosity to understanding. "Maybe you should think before you speak," she finished, her heart racing, but her spirit soaring. "People like us deserve kindness, not scorn." The silence that followed was deafening. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his bravado dissipating in the face of her fierce spirit. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself, caught off guard by the strength of a woman he had so carelessly dismissed. Isaac, the young cashier, finally spoke up, breaking the tension that had enveloped the store. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, ma'am. I've seen you here before, and I know how hard you work for your husband. Your strength is admirable." His sincerity cut through the awkwardness, and Mrs. Louise felt the warmth spreading through her. "Thank you, dear," she replied, her voice softening. "It means more than you know." The other customers began to shift, murmurs of support rippling through the line. "You're right," one woman said, stepping forward. "We should treat each other with respect, no matter what our circumstances are." "Yes," another added, "that officer has no right to judge anyone." The tide had turned, and Mrs. Louise could feel the collective support of those around her bolstering her spirit. The officer, realizing he was losing control of the situation, grunted something incoherent before turning on his heel and marching out of the store, his ego bruised. As the tension lifted, Mrs. Louise took a moment to gather herself, the adrenaline slowly fading. She looked at Isaac, who smiled back at her with a warmth that felt like a lifeline. "You're all set, Mrs. Carter," he said, his tone now filled with respect. "Your total is still the same, but I'll take care of that for you today." "What?" she gasped, surprised. "It's on the house," he insisted, refusing to take no for an answer. "Consider it a small act of kindness for someone who shows so much strength and grace." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes as she realized that, amid the cruelty, there was also compassion. "Thank you, Isaac. Thank you for seeing me," she whispered, her heart swelling with gratitude. As she bagged her items, the other customers began to express their support as well, voicing words of encouragement. "You're an inspiration, Mrs. Carter," one man said, while a young woman added, "We should all aspire to be as strong as you." In that moment, Mrs. Louise felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. What had begun as a humiliating experience had transformed into something beautiful, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are always rays of light. As she stepped outside, the sun was shining bright, and the fresh air filled her lungs. She knew that the road ahead would still be challenging, but in that moment, surrounded by newfound allies and filled with determination, she felt ready to face whatever came next. She was more than just a woman buying diapers. She was a warrior for her husband, a beacon of resilience, and a reminder to everyone around her that kindness and understanding were worth fighting for. As she made her way to the car, her heart full, she glanced back at the store. There, behind the register, Isaac was smiling at her, a symbol of hope in a world that could sometimes seem so dark. Mrs. Louise knew that no matter the challenges ahead, she would always carry the strength of her love for Mr. Carter, and that love would guide her through any storm. With renewed determination, she climbed into her car, ready to return home to the man she cherished most. Together, they would navigate the challenges that lay ahead, side by side, just as they always had. And in that moment, as she drove away, Mrs. Louise realized that even in the face of ridicule, she had emerged victorious, stronger than ever, and ready to inspire others with her story of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds that define us. The heart of the home. As Mrs. Louise drove through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, she felt a renewed sense of purpose surging within her. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the houses, each one holding its own stories, joys, and struggles. She glanced at the passenger seat, where the bags of diapers rested, symbols of her unwavering commitment to Mr. Carter. It struck her how something so simple could carry such profound significance. Arriving home, she parked the car and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of vanilla and lavender wafting through the air. The cozy living room was filled with mementos from their life together, a testament to their love and shared experiences. Pictures hung on the walls, capturing moments of laughter and adventure, each frame a cherished memory that brought a smile to her face. "Louise," Mr. Carter called from the living room, his voice still strong despite the challenges he faced. "Is that you? I've been waiting for you to come back." His words melted away the weight of the day's events. She hurried to the living room, her heart swelling at the sight of him. He was settled comfortably in his armchair, a blanket draped over his legs. The dim light from the lamp cast a warm glow, illuminating his handsome features, weathered yet still vibrant. His hair had turned silver, but his eyes sparkled with the same playful spirit she had fallen in love with decades ago. "Here I am," she replied, her voice brightening as she rushed to his side. "I brought you a little something from the store." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, what is it?" "Just some essentials," she said, pulling out the diapers with a slight flourish. "I hope you don't mind, but I also brought home some treats. Thought you might enjoy a cookie or two while we catch up." "Only if you promise to share," he laughed, the sound warm and rich, filling the room with joy. As she retrieved the cookies from the kitchen, Mrs. Louise's heart felt light. The weight of the world had lifted slightly, and she relished these small moments of happiness. She placed a plate of cookies on the table next to his chair and settled into the couch opposite him, eager to hear about his day. "You wouldn't believe the stories I heard from the guys at the community center today," he began, his eyes lighting up. "You know Frank, the one who always plays chess. He was telling us about the time he almost fell off a fishing boat trying to reel in a huge catfish." Mrs. Louise laughed, the sound echoing off the walls like music. "I can just imagine him, flailing around, trying to keep his balance. Did he manage to catch it?" "Not a chance." Mr. Carter chuckled, his laughter infectious. "He ended up splashing everyone around him and losing his bait. The fish were probably laughing at him. We had a good time reminiscing about our younger days, before the war, before everything changed. It's important to keep those memories alive, don't you think?" "Absolutely," she replied, her eyes softening. "Those stories are the threads that weave our lives together. They remind us of who we are and where we've come from." The conversation flowed easily, as it always did between them. As they shared stories and laughter, the world outside faded away. It was in these moments that they found solace, sheltering each other from the storm of challenges that lay beyond their front door. As the night wore on, Mrs. Louise couldn't shake the events from the store earlier that day. She found herself reflecting on the courage it had taken to stand up to the officer. While she had initially felt like a victim, she had discovered strength she didn't know she possessed. "You know, dear," she began tentatively, "something unexpected happened at the store today." Mr. Carter turned to her, his curiosity piqued. "Oh, do tell." "I faced a rather unpleasant officer," she confessed, biting her lip. "He made a scene, mocking me for buying diapers, as if it was something to be ashamed of. But I didn't let him get away with it." Her husband's expression shifted to one of concern, but she pressed on. "I spoke up, told him about you, about the sacrifices you made for our country, and how much you mean to me. And suddenly, everyone in the store began to rally around me. I felt so supported, like I was no longer alone in my struggle." Mr. Carter's eyes sparkled with pride. "That's my Louise," he said softly, his voice full of warmth. "You've always had a way of turning adversity into something beautiful. I've admired that about you since the day we met." She blushed at his words, feeling the warmth of his love wrap around her like a familiar embrace. "It wasn't just me, though. It was the people in the store. Isaac, the cashier, and even some of the other customers. They all stood up for me. It was a reminder that kindness still exists, even when it feels overshadowed by negativity." Mr. Carter reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. "You have a gift for bringing out the best in others, my love. That's your superpower. You turn every moment into an opportunity for connection, for understanding. The evening wore on, filled with laughter and stories that danced like fireflies in the night. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Mrs. Louise leaned back, feeling a gentle weariness settle in her bones. "Time flies when you're with the person you love," she said softly, gazing into Mr. Carter's eyes. "I don't want this night to end." "Neither do I," he replied, a hint of mischief in his voice. "But I can already see the fatigue in your eyes, and you need your rest. You've had quite the day, and I need my beautiful wife by my side, fresh and full of energy for tomorrow." As she rose to prepare for bed, a sense of contentment enveloped her. The world outside may have been filled with challenges and moments of cruelty, but inside their home there was warmth, love, and the promise of a new day. Later, as they settled into bed, the soft sound of Mr. Carter's breathing calmed her racing thoughts. She lay there, her head resting on his chest, the rhythmic beating of his heart a soothing melody. In that cocoon of safety, she whispered, "You know, dear, you have always been my rock, my safe haven." "And you've always been my light," he replied, brushing a gentle kiss on the top of her head. "Together, we're unstoppable." With those words lingering in the air, Mrs. Louise drifted into a peaceful sleep, her heart full and her spirit lifted. She dreamed of sunlit mornings, shared laughter, and the unwavering bond that had weathered every storm. She knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, armed with love, resilience, and the strength of their shared history. In the quiet hours of the night, the world outside continued to turn, but within the walls of their home, a love story was being written, one of courage, compassion, and the indomitable spirit of two souls who had found their way through life's trials, hand in hand. The ripple of kindness. Morning light streamed through the curtains, painting the room in soft shades of gold. Mrs. Louise awoke to the familiar sounds of her home, the chirping of birds outside and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. She stretched, savoring the warmth of the sun on her face, and turned to find Mr. Carter still asleep, a peaceful expression on his features. With a smile, she slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb him, and began her morning routine. The kitchen was filled with the aroma of brewing coffee, mingling with the scent of freshly baked muffins she had prepared the night before. She enjoyed these quiet moments before the world awoke, where she could gather her thoughts and reflect on the day ahead. As she brewed the coffee, her mind wandered back to the incident at the grocery store. The faces of the customers who had stood by her lingered in her thoughts, especially Isaac, the young cashier. His quiet support had reminded her that kindness often flourished in the most unexpected places. Inspired by this, she resolved to pay it forward, to spread the positivity she had experienced. After all, it was the small acts of kindness that could transform someone's day. With a plan forming in her mind, she prepared a plate of muffins, their rich scent wafting through the house. After pouring herself a cup of coffee, she placed the plate on the table next to Mr. Carter's armchair, hoping it would greet him when he awoke. She couldn't wait to share her idea with him. "Louise." Mr. Carter's voice broke through her thoughts as he stirred awake, blinking against the sunlight filtering through the window. "What's that delightful smell? Am I dreaming, or did you bake muffins?" "Good morning, sleepyhead," she said, her face lighting up with joy. "They're fresh out of the oven, just for you. I thought we could have a little breakfast together." As he settled into his chair, the comforting atmosphere of their home enveloped them. "You spoil me," he said, reaching for a muffin. "You know, you have a knack for making every day feel special." "I try my best," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "But today, I want to do something more than just making muffins. I want to spread a little kindness, inspired by yesterday's events." "Oh, what do you have in mind?" he asked, genuinely intrigued. Mrs. Louise took a sip of her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "I was thinking about how the officer's words made me feel, and how the support I received from the other customers changed that moment for me. I want to create a ripple effect. I want to find a way to share kindness with others, to remind them that they are not alone, just as I felt supported." Mr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. That sounds wonderful. How do you plan to start? I thought we could go to the community center later today and share some of these muffins with the folks there, she suggested. There's bound to be someone who could use a little lift, and if we can brighten even one person's day, it will be worth it. That's a beautiful idea, Louise, he replied, his voice warm with approval. I'd love to join you. Let's spread that love together. After breakfast, Mrs. Louise and Mr. Carter began to prepare for their outing. They packed the muffins into a sturdy basket, adding napkins and a small note of encouragement, each note bearing a simple message: you are loved, you matter. Today is a new day. It was a small gesture, but she hoped it would touch hearts in ways she couldn't predict. As they drove to the community center, Mrs. Louise felt a sense of purpose driving her forward. The sun bathed the streets in a warm glow, and the world felt alive with possibilities. She glanced at Mr. Carter, who was focused on the road, a determined look on his face. Despite his physical challenges, his spirit remained unyielded, a testament to their shared strength. Upon arriving at the community center, the atmosphere buzzed with activity. Seniors gathered in small groups, sharing stories and laughter, their faces bright with the camaraderie that comes from shared experiences. Mrs. Louise felt a thrill of excitement. This was where they could make a difference. As they entered, a familiar face greeted them. It was Helen, a sprightly woman with a shock of white hair and a mischievous twinkle in her eye. Well, if it isn't the lovely couple, what brings you two here today? We brought some muffins to share, Mrs. Louise said, her voice warm with enthusiasm. And we wanted to spread some kindness. Helen clapped her hands together, her smile infectious. How wonderful. You always know how to brighten up a room. The trio made their way to a cozy corner of the center, setting up a small table for their treats. As they arranged the muffins, Mrs. Louise noticed a few familiar faces glancing their way, some with curiosity, others with smiles. Would you like to help us out? She called to a couple of seniors nearby. We're spreading some joy with these muffins and notes. Everyone is welcome. At her invitation, several seniors began to approach, drawn by the enticing aroma and the warmth of the moment. They gathered around, exchanging smiles and stories as Mrs. Louise and Mr. Carter handed out muffins, each person receiving not just a treat, but also a note of encouragement. Thank you for this, dear, said Mr. Johnson, a retired teacher with a gentle demeanor. These little gestures mean more than you know. It's our pleasure, Mr. Carter replied, his spirit lifting as he connected with the community. We believe that kindness is like a warm hug. It makes everything better. The atmosphere buzzed with laughter and chatter, the muffins quickly disappearing as they were shared among friends and newcomers alike. The sense of community enveloped Mrs. Louise, a balm to the scars left by the previous day's humiliation. As they continued to engage with the seniors, Mrs. Louise felt her heart swell. Every smile, every thank you, was a reminder that love and kindness had a remarkable power to heal. She noticed a young woman quietly observing from the edge of the room, her face etched with sadness. "Excuse me for a moment," Mrs. Louise said to Mr. Carter, her instincts telling her that the woman needed a kind word. She approached the young woman, whose eyes were downcast. "Hello there, dear. I couldn't help but notice you from across the room. Are you okay?" The young woman looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Oh, I'm fine. Just observing." Mrs. Louise sat down next to her. "Sometimes it helps to talk. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." The woman sighed, her defenses crumbling. "I'm struggling, honestly. I just moved here and don't know anyone. I feel lost." Mrs. Louise's heart ached for her. "I understand how you feel. New beginnings can be overwhelming. But you're not alone. We're all here to support one another. Would you like to join us for some muffins? They're homemade and full of love." The young woman hesitated for a moment, then nodded, a faint smile breaking through her sadness. "Sure, I'd like that." As they made their way back to the group, Mrs. Louise introduced her to Mr. Carter and the other seniors. The young woman's smile grew brighter as she tasted the muffins and engaged in light-hearted conversations. Slowly, the warmth of the community began to envelop her, drawing her into its embrace. Mrs. Louise stepped back for a moment, watching the scene unfold before her. She realized that this simple act of sharing muffins had created a ripple effect of kindness. It wasn't just about the treats. It was about connection, compassion, and lifting each other up. By the time they wrapped up their visit, the center was filled with laughter, joy, and new friendships blossoming. As they packed up their basket, Mrs. Louise felt a sense of fulfillment wash over her. She had set out to spread kindness, and in return, she had received a treasure trove of joy. On their drive home, Mr. Carter turned to her, his eyes reflecting pride and admiration. "You truly have a gift, Louise. You have a way of bringing people together, of making them feel valued. Today was magical." She smiled, the warmth of his words igniting her spirit. It was a reminder that kindness is a two-way street. We give, and we receive in ways we may never fully understand. And every little act counts. As they arrived home, Mrs. Louise felt lighter, filled with hope and gratitude. Their lives were intertwined with love and resilience, and today's journey had reinforced that truth. Later that evening, they settled on the couch, the comforting familiarity of their home surrounding them. The events of the day played in her mind, a tapestry of connections woven through shared experiences. "Louise," Mr. Carter asked softly, breaking the comfortable silence, "do you think we can do something like this again? I'd love to help spread kindness." Mrs. Louise's heart swelled at his words. "Absolutely. I would love that. This is just the beginning." As they discussed ideas for future outings, her heart was light with possibility. Together, they would continue to cultivate a spirit of kindness, turning moments of isolation into opportunities for connection. In the embrace of their love, they found strength not only for themselves but also for others. As the evening wore on, the world outside faded into the background. Together, they forged a path filled with compassion. The strength of community. The following week, the sun rose with an unusually bright intensity, as if the world was waking up to embrace a new beginning. Mrs. Louise and Mr. Carter found themselves energized by the successful day they had spent at the community center. After sharing muffins and kindness, they had received heartfelt gratitude and witnessed the connections that formed among the seniors and the young woman, whom they had learned was named Clara. With the warmth of community spirit in their hearts, the couple set a new plan in motion. Mrs. Louise proposed organizing a small gathering at their home, inviting the people they had met at the center, including Clara. "It'll be a cozy potluck," she suggested one evening over dinner. "Everyone can bring a dish to share, and we can create an evening filled with laughter, stories, and friendship." Mr. Carter smiled, excitement flickering in his eyes. "That sounds perfect. We can prepare a few of those muffins, and maybe some sandwiches to go along with it. It'll be a great opportunity for everyone to connect more deeply." They spent the next few days preparing for the event. Louise spent hours in the kitchen, experimenting with new recipes, creating an assortment of appetizers, and baking more muffins. The fragrance of freshly baked bread filled their home, creating an inviting atmosphere. Meanwhile, Mr. Carter set about organizing seating arrangements, ensuring everyone would feel comfortable and welcomed. On the day of the potluck, the couple transformed their living room into a warm and inviting space. They set up a long table adorned with a colorful tablecloth and an array of dishes. Each item was accompanied by a small card describing the dish and the person who made it. As guests began to arrive, the air filled with the sounds of cheerful greetings and laughter. Clara, carrying a tray of her famous lasagna, was one of the first to arrive. "I hope everyone's ready for a feast," she said, her smile brightening the room. "Absolutely," Mrs. Louise replied, welcoming her with open arms. "You're just in time to help us set up." As the evening progressed, more guests arrived, each bringing something special to share. Mr. Johnson arrived with a pot of his award-winning chili, and Helen brought a delightful apple pie that filled the room with the comforting aroma of cinnamon. With each new arrival, the energy of the gathering grew, wrapping everyone in a warm embrace. Once everyone settled, Mrs. Louise welcomed the group, her voice filled with warmth and excitement. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight, we celebrate community, friendship, and the little moments that connect us. Let's enjoy each other's company and the wonderful food we've prepared." With laughter echoing in the air, they dug into the array of dishes, sharing bites and exchanging compliments about each creation. Clara found herself seated next to Mr. Carter, who was regaling her with stories from his teaching days. The more they spoke, the more Clara relaxed, her laughter ringing out like music. As the night wore on, it became clear that the potluck was more than just a meal. It was a tapestry of shared experiences, stories, and laughter. People who had once been strangers were now engaged in heartfelt conversations, forging connections that would likely extend beyond that evening. Mrs. Louise noticed how the atmosphere was charged with a sense of belonging. She wandered around the room, her heart swelling with joy as she witnessed the friendships blossoming. Old stories were recounted, and new memories were made. The laughter of the elderly mingled with Clara's youthful enthusiasm, creating a harmonious blend of voices. As the evening progressed, a moment of stillness fell upon the gathering. Clara stood up, raising her glass of sparkling water, her face glowing with appreciation. "I just wanted to say how thankful I am to all of you for making me feel so welcome," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Moving to a new place is daunting, but you've all made it feel like home. This night has truly meant the world to me." Her words resonated deeply, and the room erupted into applause. Mrs. Louise's eyes glistened with tears of happiness. She could see the bond forming among them, the genuine connections that were being cultivated. This was the power of community, an unbreakable thread that wove together to the fabric of their lives. "Thank you, Clara, for reminding us of the importance of connection," Mrs. Louise said, standing to join Clara. "It's these moments that inspire us to continue reaching out to one another, to support and uplift. Together, we can create something beautiful." The group fell into a warm chatter, voices overlapping as they shared their dreams and hopes. Conversations flowed effortlessly, punctuated by laughter and stories that bridged generations. Each shared moment built a sense of unity that enveloped everyone present, creating a safety net of belonging. As the evening drew to a close, the energy shifted into a more relaxed vibe. Mr. Carter proposed a game that had been a favorite of his students, a light-hearted trivia game that would allow everyone to share a bit about themselves. The atmosphere erupted with cheers and laughter, and the room transformed into a lively arena of friendly competition. The trivia questions ranged from history to pop culture, and as they played, the competitive spirit was palpable, but so was the camaraderie. Each correct answer was met with cheers, and even the wrong ones elicited hearty laughter and playful banter. "Who knew you were such a trivia master?" Clara teased Mr. Johnson when he got a question about 1960s music right. "I'll have to come to you for advice next time I go to a quiz night." By the end of the game, everyone was in high spirits, their laughter echoing off the walls. Mrs. Louise glanced at Mr. Carter, their eyes meeting with a shared understanding that their efforts had blossomed into something wonderful. They had created a safe space where everyone felt valued and included. As guests began to leave, they exchanged hugs and promises to gather again. Clara lingered, a radiant smile lighting up her face. "Thank you so much for tonight. It's been the best experience since I moved here. You've both brought so much joy into my life." "It's our pleasure, Clara," Mrs. Louise replied, wrapping her arms around her. "You're a part of our community now, and we'd love to see you again soon. Let's keep this going." "Definitely. I'll bring dessert next time," Clara exclaimed, her enthusiasm infectious. Once the last guest had departed, Mrs. Louise and Mr. Carter began to clean up, the remnants of the evening scattered around them like little pieces of joy. As they worked side by side, Mrs. Louise reflected on the success of the night. "I can't believe how wonderful that turned out," she said, her heart still fluttering from the evening's warmth. "It feels like we've started something special." "We have," Mr. Carter replied, glancing at her with pride. "Tonight wasn't just about food. It was about connection and support. You've opened up a world of possibilities for all of us." With each dish that was washed and every crumb that was swept away, they felt a sense of fulfillment. The community they were nurturing was blossoming, and each small gathering would continue to weave them closer together. As they finally settled onto the couch, exhausted but exhilarated, Mrs. Louise sighed contentedly. "Tonight was magical, but I can't help but think about what comes next. How can we keep this momentum going?" Mr. Carter leaned back, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Perhaps we could establish a monthly gathering, where everyone brings a dish and we explore different themes or activities. It could help us connect more deeply and foster friendships." "That sounds perfect," she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "We could even incorporate activities like book discussions or game nights. The possibilities are endless." Their minds began to race with ideas, mapping out plans for the future, not just for gatherings, but for building a network of support that would extend beyond their home. They envisioned a community that thrived on connection, support, and love, each person contributing their unique essence to the fabric of their lives. As the evening wore on, they made a pact to continue their journey of kindness, to create a welcoming space where everyone could feel valued, and to inspire others to join in. Mrs. Louise felt a renewed sense of purpose wash over her, knowing that they were capable of making a meaningful impact in the lives of those around them. Before bed, they reflected on the connections that had formed and the ripple effect of kindness that had blossomed from a simple act of sharing muffins. They were reminded that in a world filled with chaos, the strength of community and compassion could illuminate the darkest corners. As they turned off the lights and settled in for the night, Mrs. Louise felt grateful for the love they shared and the opportunity to foster connections that would transform lives. The warmth of that day lingered in her heart, a beacon of hope and encouragement, propelling her to continue spreading kindness far and wide. With dreams of future gatherings dancing in her mind, she drifted into a peaceful sleep, knowing that tomorrow was another chance to cultivate community, kindness, and love, one muffin at a time. The Garden of Connections. As the weeks passed, the community gatherings at Mr. Carter and Mrs. Louise's home became a cherished ritual. Each month brought new faces and old friends together, creating a tapestry of stories, laughter, and shared experiences. The potlucks evolved, and with Clara's enthusiastic input, the group introduced themed evenings that allowed everyone to showcase their culinary skills and cultural backgrounds. This month, the theme was Around the World in a Bite. Each guest was invited to bring a dish representing a different country, transforming their cozy home into a miniature global marketplace. Excitement buzzed in the air as the day approached. Clara, who had become an integral part of the community, decided to prepare a traditional Spanish paella, while Mr. Johnson opted for his famous chili, taking the opportunity to spice it up with a hint of international flair by adding a touch of Jamaican jerk seasoning. Mrs. Louise spent days planning for the event, curating decorations that reflected a global theme. She found colorful tablecloths adorned with maps, flags from different countries, and a world map that she used as the centerpiece, where guests could mark their favorite dishes. Mr. Carter helped her hang up fairy lights, creating a warm, inviting glow that made their living room feel like a festive haven. The evening of the gathering arrived, and the couple's home buzzed with excitement as guests began to arrive, bringing dishes that reflected their unique heritages. The aroma of various cuisines filled the air: samosas, Italian pasta salad, Greek spanakopita, pita, and even a luscious chocolate mousse that Mrs. Smith had prepared to represent France. Clara stepped into the living room, beaming with pride as she carried her paella. "I can't wait for everyone to try this," she exclaimed, setting it down beside the map. "I hope it transports them to Spain." "Knowing your cooking, Clara, I have no doubt it will," Mrs. Louise replied with a smile, her heart swelling with appreciation for the sense of community they had nurtured together. As guests gathered around the food, the room filled with an infectious energy, with laughter and chatter overlapping. People exchanged stories about their dishes, sharing family traditions and memories tied to their recipes. It was a feast not just for the stomach, but for the soul, an opportunity to learn about each other's cultures and histories. "Did you know that paella originated from Valencia?" Clara shared as she served generous portions to her eager friends. "It's usually made with rice, saffron, and a variety of proteins. My grandmother used to make it for special occasions, and I can still hear her voice guiding me through the process." The others listened intently, hanging on her every word, drawn into her vivid recollections. The beauty of the night was in the shared narratives that unfolded with each bite, knitting the group closer together. As they began to eat, Mrs. Louise encouraged everyone to take turns sharing a story related to their dish. Mr. Johnson recounted the story of how he had first learned to make chili while serving in the military, bonding with his fellow soldiers over spicy meals during long nights on watch. Helen shared the significance of her apple pie, describing how it had been a staple at family gatherings since her childhood, a recipe passed down through generations. With each story, they became more than just neighbors. They became a family woven together by shared experiences, laughter, and the comfort of good food. Clara noticed how even the quietest guests began to open up, their voices mingling in a harmonious chorus of connection. After everyone had shared their stories, Mr. Carter suggested a game. "Let's have an international trivia contest," he declared, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "We can test our knowledge about the countries represented here tonight." The room erupted in cheers as everyone rallied to form teams. Laughter and friendly competition ensued, with Clara's team often taking the lead, her knowledge of world cultures shining through. As they played, Clara noticed the increasing bond between the guests. The competition fostered teamwork and collaboration, weaving deeper connections among them. As the night wore on, the energy in the room transformed into a comfortable camaraderie. Conversations flowed freely, and guests began to mingle, moving from group to group, sharing not only food but laughter and friendship. Eventually, as the evening began to wind down, Mrs. Louise gathered everyone's attention. "I just want to take a moment to express how thankful we are for all of you," she said, her voice soft but filled with sincerity. "Each one of you brings something unique to our gatherings, and it's incredible to see the friendships blossoming. You've turned our home into a true community." Applause filled the room, and Clara felt a warm flush of happiness spread through her. It was moments like these that reinforced her decision to stay in this new town. She had found not just friends but a family. "Let's make a pact," Clara suggested, her eyes sparkling. "How about we choose a charity to support together? We can use our gatherings to raise awareness, or even collect donations for a cause we all care about." The idea resonated deeply with everyone, and discussions erupted about various charities, animal shelters, food banks, and environmental organizations. As they deliberated, it became evident that each person had a cause close to their heart. They decided to focus on supporting local food banks, recognizing that their shared love for food could be a powerful force for good in the community. As the night came to a close, they discussed potential ideas for fundraising events, brainstorming ways to turn their love for cooking and gathering into a means of giving back. Clara's face shone with excitement as she imagined the possibilities: cooking classes, bake sales, and even a community cook-off to showcase everyone's culinary talents. "We can have fun while making a difference," she exclaimed, her enthusiasm contagious. "Let's put our skills to work for a greater purpose." The group left that night with full hearts and the promise of new beginnings. As Clara stepped out into the crisp evening air, she felt a sense of belonging that had eluded her for so long. She glanced back at Mr. Carter and Mrs. Louise's home, illuminated by warm lights and laughter, and knew she had found her place within this vibrant tapestry of community. Days turned into weeks, and the energy from the potluck continued to ripple through the neighborhood. The group met regularly to plan their charitable efforts, their excitement growing with each brainstorming session. Clara felt an exhilarating sense of purpose as they discussed ideas, creating a vibrant list of activities that would bring people together while also helping those in need. Their first event was a community bake sale, where each person would contribute their favorite baked goods. Clara volunteered to lead the effort, drawing on her connections with local bakeries and shops to secure donations for the sale. The group mobilized, sharing their expertise and reaching out to neighbors to raise awareness. The day of the bake sale arrived, and the community center buzzed with activity. Tables were laden with cupcakes, cookies, bread, and pastries, their sweet scents wafting through the air. As people strolled through, Clara felt a surge of pride. They had worked hard to put this together, and the turnout was beyond what they had anticipated. Families gathered around, children with sticky fingers grabbing cookies, while others chatted and enjoyed the atmosphere. Mr. Johnson set up a booth to talk about the importance of food banks, sharing his experiences and encouraging others to contribute. Clara circulated through the crowd, engaging with patrons, her smile bright and welcoming. As the sale continued, the group found themselves enveloped in a whirlwind of joy. Their efforts had paid off, raising not only funds but awareness for the local food bank. Clara looked around at her friends, feeling a sense of fulfillment wash over her. It was more than just a sale. It was a celebration of community, a testament to the connections they had forged. By the end of the day, they had raised a substantial amount of money. Clara and the group decided to personally deliver the donations to the food bank, eager to see the impact of their hard work firsthand. As they arrived, the warmth of gratitude from the volunteers welcomed them. They shared stories of how vital community support was in ensuring families had enough to eat, reinforcing the importance of their mission. In that moment, Clara understood the true power of connection and community. It was more than just gathering together. It was about using their voices and skills to uplift those around them. She felt a swell of hope as she realized that their little group had sparked something significant, an awakening that extended beyond the four walls of Mr. Carter and Mrs. Louise's home. As the weeks turned into months, Clara found herself thriving within this newfound community. The regular gatherings turned into a beacon of light in her life, illuminating her path with friendship and purpose. Each event brought new challenges, new connections, and countless opportunities for growth. Inspired by their initial success, the group expanded their efforts. They organized a community garden project, where neighbors could come together to grow fresh produce. Clara was particularly excited about this initiative. She envisioned it as a space for education and collaboration, where everyone could learn about sustainable gardening practices while also cultivating relationships. As they prepared to launch the garden, Clara took the lead, organizing meetings to discuss logistics and plan how to best utilize the available land. This garden will be a place of learning and connection, she shared during one meeting, her passion evident. We can host workshops on gardening, cooking demonstrations, and even have picnics to celebrate our harvest. The excitement was palpable as they set to work, transforming an unused plot of land into a vibrant oasis. Clara relished in the collective effort, the way each person contributed their skills and ideas. They tilled the soil, planted seeds, and watched as tiny green sprouts began to break through the earth, each one representing their hard work and dedication.